Alright, what's up, Trey? I just thought I would make this video kind of going over the basics of Roblox Studio and everything that you really need to know for right now. Because Roblox Studio is pretty simple. There's not too much going on that's gonna confuse things. Most of what you see in Studio is just there for convenience, and there's usually multiple ways to do the same thing. So, most of these things that you see in these tabs. They're just other ways of doing the exact same thing. So it's not like every single feature in these tabs is a new thing. So anyway, this is what it's gonna look like for you probably when you open Studio. You have it's You're probably also gonna have the output window here, like right at the bottom of your screen maybe. But the most prominent tabs that I would say is the Explorer tab, and definitely the most important. The Explorer window here, you can, as for any window, you can just click the top of it and drag it, and you can either have it as a separate window, or if you move it close enough to the edge of a screen, then you can reposition it there. You could have it here. That's all just preference. Personally, the way that I like to set up my Explorer window is by having it right here. And if you have a properties window open, then I would suggest clicking it, dragging it over to the left side. This for me just works a lot better because whenever you click on an object, you notice how many properties here uh, there are for that object. It's just easier to kind of have a separate access window to these properties than to have it right here, in a small window, and you have to kind of like scroll a million times to find what you're looking for. But anyway, um, so that's that. Uh, and when I'm just in Studio like this and I'm not using properties, I'll usually just close it. But anyway, so basic navigation, WASD is to move around in 3D space. W is just going to propel you in whichever direction you're looking at. You can change direction by holding down right click and moving your mouse. I think we already kind of went over this, but and then if you press W, you're gonna move forward in whichever direction you're facing. So you can move around like that. But yeah. And then what next? So there's four main tabs that you have to be worried about for now. This plugins tab, you don't really have to pay attention to because plugins are just extra features that you install into Studio, like extra tools that you can use made by developers and stuff like that. So you don't really need to worry about that. So I guess first thing we'll talk about are the uh, four transformation options here for objects. So the select, move, scale, and rotate, these are just different ways that you can transform an object. So how do we insert an object? Well, usually, and you'll see this button right here, it'll say part. Usually it'll look like this instead of the cylinder that I had earlier. Um, so if you click on this, it will just insert a basic part that you can do whatever you want with. To move it, you can just click it and drag it around. And you can see that it's only moving one stud at a time as I drag it. So not a lot of room for precision here. We'll talk about that soon. And what I mean by stud is if you see all of these squares on this grid, each one of these squares is called a stud. It's basically the most, or it's not the smallest unit you can move, but it's like the most fundamental unit. Everything is measured in studs. So that's kind of like the metric for Roblox Studio. Like in real life, you think, we talk about meters to describe how things move. Obviously, there are things that are smaller than a meter, but a meter is like the basic unit of measurement. So, studs are the basic unit of measurement in Roblox. Um, you also have the move uh, option here, and if you click on this, you can see that when this part is selected, you have the arrows that actually represent which axes this part moves along. So red is the x-axis. You can move positive x, negative x. Blue is positive z, negative z, and green is positive y, negative y. So that's how you control the precise movement on a specific axis. Scale is just to resize the part, so you can also make the part grow larger in one direction. Um, and yeah, so that's how that works. Just drag these little things right here, and you can just kind of play around with that. Rotate. If I click on this and select rotate, you see I have all of these axis wheels here. If I click on any part of this wheel and hold it, you can see it kind of gives me a clock-like UI here that shows me, how I'm rotating the part. So this rotates it along the Z-axis. The red will rotate it along the X-axis, and green will be the Y-axis. So that's how you can rotate it. Also, if you have a rotated part like this, and you select it and you move it, it will not keep its rotation. It will snap back to its regular orientation. That is supposed to happen. If you want to move an object while it's rotated, then, for example, if I rotate this at some random orientation, if you can use the move button here and move it on a specific axis, and that will keep its rotation. But honestly, what I would do is, because this isn't really the best way to move it, because you can see it's only going to move in the direction that it's facing, and if you rotate it, that will change its direction, and, it might just be kind of complicated if you're trying to move it to a specific point. So what I would do is always make sure that your part is in the location that it should be in first, and then rotate it. So the rotation thing should always be like the last thing that you change about the part. But again, this is really just building stuff, so you're probably not going to be too concerned with that just yet. But that's just basics for part transformations if you're interested. These other things here you don't have to worry about at all. Well, maybe collisions. I'll talk about collisions. This collisions checkbox right here. But geometric and joint surfaces, or join surfaces, you don't have to worry about. So before I talk about collisions, I'll also just briefly mention the copy, cut, paste, or duplicate buttons here. So if you're already familiar with, like, how you copy and paste something like text in other programs, it's the same thing in Studio. So if I select an object, I can do Control C to copy it. So I just press Control C. Now if I press Control V, that's to paste. And obviously I can do Control V as many times as I want, and that will also continue to paste it. If I don't want an object anymore, then I can select it and click Control X, and that will remove it. So that's what all of these do. I would just, use the hotkeys. I wouldn't actually use any of these buttons here. It's kind of tedious. But anyway, so the collisions box is responsible for handling how two objects collide when you're moving them. Now, you can see right now it's disabled, which I always keep disabled just because this allows, it gives you more control over the positioning of objects in your world space. Especially the more cluttered it gets, you're going to want to have this disabled. Basically, having this disabled means that, as you can see when I drag this object, it'll go right through this other part. If I enable collisions, this will actually still go through the part when I move it, except if I use any of these other transformation features like move, you can see if I try to move this on a specific axis, it'll actually stop when it hits this part, and it'll just teleport in front of it instead of actually passing through it. So it'll actually collide with this object. Same thing goes for scale. If I try to resize it, and it intersects with this object, then it'll just stop right there. So, that's what having collisions enabled does. I actually don't know if it does the same thing for rotate. I imagine it would. So if I tried rotating this to the point where it would intersect, yeah, it won't actually pass through it. So And then of course if I disable collisions, then this could freely pass through this object. So that's what that does. And that's pretty much how those features work. You don't have to worry about geometric and physical mode too much at all. I would just always keep this on geometric for now. You can play around with physical if you want. It's just a different way of moving parts and how they interact with each other when you move them. Uh, editor, terrain editor, is something you also don't have to worry about. It's just basically a fancier version of this base plate. It uses voxel terrain with texture mapping, which is just a fancy way of saying that instead of having a terrain that looks blocky, it's a terrain that uses 3D points in your world, and you can create kind of like smooth, rugged, landscape-ish looking maps, and it has a texture on it. So you can actually see if I click on this, you have all this stuff that you can use to create terrain. And so I'll just show you what it looks like since I can't really explain it that well. It's just stuff that looks like this. So this is like, kind of ray tracing, lighting, and kind of like more realistic looking kind of stuff if you wanted to have a game like that. This actually is something that we're going to look at later on for making a game because, this is a lot nicer than using blocky terrain in some cases. But anyway, also, if you do something like this, or if you make any change in your game and you want to undo it, you can press Control Z, and that will undo the last change that you made. If you want to undo your undo, or in other words, cancel and undo, then you can do Control Y, and that'll put it back. So I'm doing Control Y now, and then I'm going to do Control Z again. So that's how you can kind of go forward and backward in time there. Toolbox, you also don't really have to worry about. Toolbox is really the only aspect of Toolbox that I would personally worry about is if you want to save something that you created in Studio and then import it back into Studio or import it back into another game that you're working on. So if I click on Toolbox, we have this window open, and we have these 4 tabs here. We have Marketplace. This shows you all the things that other creators have made and published. If I click on any of these things, it will insert it into my game. Sometimes if it's a tool, like this sword object, it'll prompt you with this. And you could just always click no on that. It's asking you if you want to put it into this starter service, which you don't have to worry about right now. So just do no, and you can see that it inserts this object into my game. Objects that aren't tools like this, if I click on this, then that just gets inserted right into the game. And you can see it highlighted in Workspace under Explorer, and I'm just gonna Control X that because I don't want that right now. So these are all the things that other people have made. You can drop down different categories of things like images that other people have made, etc. The inventory thing is everything that you've made, so this is really the only thing that I use Toolbox for because I like to make my own stuff. And these are all the categories for your own stuff. And you don't have to worry about these other 2 tabs. It's just like recents and other creations. So, yeah, and if you want to save something that you created, you can either select it, or if it's multiple things together that you want to save, you can click and drag, and everything within this selection window will be selected, and you can do stuff with it. So if I have like a whole bunch of objects here, and I want to save this as a model, or just save it to my account or my toolbox, I can select these. You can see they all get highlighted. And I can right-click either in the world space window, or I can right-click in the Explorer window, and I can do save to Roblox, and then it gives you this window where you can create a title for it, a name for it, a description. You can actually select the creator if you want it to be you, or if you want it to be like an organization that you made. All this other stuff, you do submit, and then it'll show up in your toolbox. So I'm just going to cancel that for now since I don't care about that. Yes. Oh, wait. Discard. There you go. And I don't think I talked about this yet. This is just the basic way that you can insert. I think I did cover that. So yeah, you can select different shapes of objects here. Obviously, there are more shape options than this, but these are just basic shapes. So if you want a sphere, then you can click on sphere, all that stuff. UI is for editing like 2D screens that you want to have in your game. Like maybe you have a chat window here and you want to change the size of the chat window. You can click on that. But for this purpose, we don't really care about that either. So we're just going to move back to home. Material and color, these are exclusively just for changing the material and color properties of objects. So if I select an object here, I can click on this drop down for material, and these are all of the different basic built-in materials that you can select. So if I click glass, for which object did I have selected? Was it this one? Yeah. So you can see now this has kind of a glassy looking texture to it. It's kind of subtle. Can't really see it that well. If I change this to concrete, you can see it's a little better to see, a little easier to see now. Brick. There is granite. You know, all this other stuff. You can play around with that. The color obviously changes the color, so these are all of the choices you have. So yeah, you can do that. I personally don't use this window for color and material. I edit everything in the properties window, because it's just kind of a habit, and also more often than not, you're changing more than just material and color. So, yeah. Another thing, yeah, and the rest of these things, everything here, you can change in the properties window of the object, so you don't really have to worry about this. The play and game settings thing, I rarely mess with game settings. And the play here is just to run a simulation of your game. But I usually don't use this because it runs the simulation of your game and then it saves it. So I would actually kind of avoid doing that. If you want to run a simulation of your game, I would go to this test tab here, but we'll get to that in a second. So everything after this part thing right here, all of these things, I really just wouldn't mess with at all. They're completely optional. So the next thing we have is the model tab, and again, you can see here we have the same transformation options for objects, plus this new one called transform. Again, this transform thing is completely optional. It just gives you kind of a new way, a new GUI to transform it. So if I click on this when I have a part selected, you can see it just gives me like a fancier way to rotate things. I can rotate with more precision by rotating outside of this wheel, or if I rotate in the wheel, I can rotate in increments, and it shows me the number of degrees that I'm rotating. So that's kind of neat. I don't ever use this. I mean, maybe I could. This was kind of a newer feature added, but you don't have to use this if you want to be more precise. If you want to be really precise when changing the properties of an object, you should change it directly in the properties window when you select it. And I'll show you how to access that in a bit. So for now, I wouldn't worry about transform. And whenever you want to go back to the default regular way of dragging apart, just click on the select arrow right here, and then you can just move it freely again. So yeah, and then you still have these other things here that we talked about. You have this new thing, which is grid movement. So this is kind of like how I was talking about before, where you can move objects with more precision than just one stud, but one stud is the default. So you see right here, the move thing being selected, it says one stud. I could change this to 0.1, so that's a tenth of a stud. So now when I move this object, you can see that I'm moving in increments of 1/10 of a stud, which is a lot more precise if I wanted to really, really like accurate movement. But usually I keep this on one stud, just like that. If you want to have infinite precision, or as close to infinite precision as you can get, then see how this move thing is checked. That means that we're going to be using this one stud increment. But if I uncheck this move box, now when I move this object, you can see that it's like, the movement is completely smooth, and there's no, like, it's using the smallest increment of movement possible. So I rarely use that because it's hard to keep track of the position of the part, and also it's not easy to tell when two parts are colliding because the precision is so small that you don't know if they're actually touching or not. So I rarely uncheck that. Usually in your game you want everything to be somewhat aligned with a grid. So, but it all depends. It all depends. Same thing for rotate. So if right now the rotate box is not checked, so the precision of rotation will be completely smooth. But if I do check this, then it's going to rotate in increments of 45 degrees. So if I do this, you can see it's like really, really choppy when I rotate it. Sometimes you want that, sometimes you don't. Just depends. Usually I keep this unchecked. So I'll just go back to regular. Align tool. Honestly, I have no idea what this does. I wouldn't worry about this. This doesn't, yeah, you don't have to worry about this for now. This is a new thing that they added. You have all this stuff that was here before, so again, that's just a repeat of what we saw in home. Union and negate, these are pretty simple. I mean, I wouldn't worry about it. Again, it's only for building. So if the way that it works is it kind of allows you to create your own slightly more complicated shapes. So if I have two objects here, and I have one selected, and I do negate, you see it'll make it kind of red. What negate and union does is if there's a negated object and it intersects another object, like these, or like this part right here, if I select both of them and then press union, it will take that red volume out of wherever it intersected. And now this object right here is its own part, and you can move it, you can scale it, all that kind of stuff. So that's just kind of another building feature that you have there. Create, I wouldn't worry about any of this stuff. These are all constraints. This is like physical movement of objects with physics enabled. That's kind of more advanced building stuff. Effects and spawn, these are just different effects that you can insert into a part. But I wouldn't, I mean, I guess you could use this. I would just use insert object, because this whole insert object menu right here gives you a list of everything, every single object that exists in Roblox. Every single type of object, I should say. Same thing with model. Service, again, you can find that in the insert object window. So, for example, if I wanted to make this part have like some kind of fire effect, I could select it and then go to effects and then select fire. And you can see now it has this kind of fiery effect. If the object is too big, it might actually just cover the whole effect itself. So usually you want to put effects on really, really small objects so that you can see the entire effect. You can also change the size of the effect by clicking on it. You can see that in Studio, if there's an arrow next to something, that means that there are objects inside of it. So if I click on the arrow and I go to fire, well, you would edit it in the properties window, but again, I'll get to that soon. So, and if I wanted, again, I could click on this part, go to insert object, and if I just type in fire, then that comes up there as well. So you don't have to use these shortcuts if you don't want to. Now we're going to get to the most interesting part of Studio, which is the script insertion, which again, you can use insert object for this. So you can use insert object for everything. So these are all completely optional. And so if I click on anything, if I select anything, and then I press script, it will insert a script in that object and open up the window. So we're not going to deal with that just yet. But yeah, if I click on something and go to insert object, I can just type in script and then boom, it's there. There's 3 different kinds of scripts in Lua, so you might be thinking like, what are the differences between all these? The regular script right here is known as a server-side script, which means that all of the code running inside of this script file is actually being run on Roblox's servers. So the server is actually executing the code. The computer that is, far away, like overseas at Roblox HQ, their computers are executing the code and then just sending the results back to your computer or all of the players' computers. A local script is code that is actually being run on your computer locally. So that's why it's called a local script. The difference between these two in terms of, I guess, performance is that obviously since Roblox's computers are running the code in a server script and sending the results back to you, there will be a delay. So for example, if you're changing something in your game world with a server script, there will be some delay before you see the results of that change. But if you're doing it with a local script, you'll actually see it instantly because your computer is the one running the code and making the change happen instantly, but it's only going to be doing it instantly on your computer, not everybody else's computer. That'll make more sense the more that we get into talking about networking and the client-server architecture and that kind of stuff. So for now, I would just use regular script because you can insert it anywhere. You can only insert local scripts in objects that are directly linked to the player. So you can't, if you're going to use a local script, you'd have to run a simulation of your game with an actual player model, which can be inconvenient if you're just trying to quickly run code. A module script is actually something that doesn't run code at all. You can think of a module script as just kind of a text file that's there. It still contains code, but it never actually runs the code. What it does is it just keeps code in this file, and then if one of these 2 scripts wants to access it to save like writing, like say for example, I don't know, you have this, it's kind of like, I can't really think of a good way of putting it. It's basically just a way of like containing a whole bunch of code that you don't really need to have in your main script. But it's here in this module script as a utility. So it's a way of kind of partitioning your code and like separating it in modules. So that's why it's called a module script. I probably didn't do a very good job of explaining that, but you don't have to worry about these 2. Just worry about this one for now. And so that is the model tab. Moving on to the test tab. Again, you have this option right here, which I never use. What I usually do is I'll keep this on local server, and that's the only option apparently. Local server and 0 players. Sometimes I'll change this to 1 player or multiple players. So if it's on 0 players and I click start, then hopefully this will show up in the OBS. Yeah. You can see that it runs this game simulation, and so this means that physics are active and everything is functioning as if the game was really running. But of course, this doesn't actually save. So as soon as I close this window, it goes back to my actual real studio. If I select 1 player, then if I start this, it will open that same window that we saw before, which is the server side window. As you can see right here in this tab, it says server. And then it opens another window where I can actually move around and interact with my game as if I was a real player. And if I go back to my server window, you know, I can observe my player from the server's perspective. If I move things around, then, you know, my player will be able to see that. So that's how that works. If you click multiple players, like 3 players, for example, then it will do the same thing, but it'll just launch like 3 different player windows. Uh, and yeah, so you can simulate your game with multiple players, not just one. So you can see right here, there's 3 versions of me. This window is one of those versions. This is another version, and you can see all of these right here are all of the different players that I am. So yeah, that's useful a lot. Especially for like really, and also if you don't want to close all those windows, as soon as you close the server window, that will exit all of the other player windows as well. So I usually keep this on 0. This, you don't have to worry about any of these. This is just for device is just for compatibility. So is player. And then you can, you know, mute or unmute audio. The view window is where you can see all of the different tabs, all of the UI in your studio. So, the first 2, the most important, are Explorer and Properties. So the Explorer window, you always have to have that open if you're going to change anything, because this is how you have access to objects in your game. The Properties window is, like I said before, I like to keep it right here on the left side. As soon as I click on an object, all of the properties for that object will appear here. So again, this is where you can change the color and material, which I much prefer to do in here so I don't have to switch tabs every time I want to change that. So again, just like we changed this part's material and color, we can do the same thing in this window, and you get the same prompt. Material, change it to force field, brick, cobblestone, concrete, diamond plate, all this other stuff. So yeah. And also, anything in the properties window of a part, you can also change with code. The properties window is really just a table of things that describe an object. So that can all be modified. All of this can be modified with a script, with code. So yeah, and then we have toolbox. So again, these just will show you all of these things right here are just the windows that you can enable or disable. So you have the output window that you can enable. Again, these are all output messages from Roblox, so you don't have to worry about these. If you want to clear the output window, you can right click it and do clear output. So that's kind of useful. I usually have that closed because as you can see, every time I open a window, it makes my actual game world smaller. And you know, when you're building stuff, especially like larger scale stuff, you usually don't want this to be that small. So I usually like to have a larger game window here, which is why I usually only have Explorer open when I'm doing stuff. And you don't really need to have any of these other windows open, like Object Browser. You know, this is like if you're just trying to. This is actually really useful. Object Browser is useful if you want to see what certain objects do. So for example, like this gives you information basically about every single kind of object, every single type of object in Roblox. So for example, like you see script right here, script context, all this kind of stuff. If I click on script, then this shows me like all of the different things that I can do to this script object. These are like all of the methods and functions that you can use on the object. So this is more for the programmer, which is really useful if you're starting out. Command bar right here is just for running like instant code, basically. I would never use this. Well, I wouldn't use it just yet because all the code that you run with command bar you actually can't undo. So if you run a line of code that you want to undo, you're kind of screwed. So this is kind of like, you know, only use this if you know what you're doing. And the rest of this really doesn't matter. We already went over terrain editor. Script performance, don't really need to worry about that. View selector, full screen. I never use these. Uh, they seem self-explanatory, but I never use them, so just kind of you can ignore it. Show grid is kind of useful because you can see right now there's this grid platform on this base plate, but it's only visible on the base plate because of a texture that the base plate has. So you can see in my Explorer window, if I open this base plate thing, you can see it has this texture. If I remove the texture, then it's just a regular base plate. But if I click Show Grid, this is actually a grid pattern that follows, it follows you around wherever you move. So, and you can see even if I move away from the base plate, even if I move all the way out here, you can see this grid pattern still follows you. So this is just kind of a neat way of, like, again, having more precision in your game if you don't have that texture, which you often won't have because you're not going to keep that grid pattern like the entire time, most likely. Or if you're building something that doesn't have a base plate, you know what I mean? So that's pretty useful. You can change the grid material as well. So if you wanted it to be not a transparent grid, and as you can see now it applies to all objects, so that's pretty useful sometimes. Wide frame rendering, I honestly don't know what this does. Oh, wireframe rendering, not wide frame rendering. This is probably only useful if you're doing stuff with terrain, like if you're making your own terrain and you don't want to render objects that are not seen. So I wouldn't really worry about that for now. That's not really relevant. Switch windows, you can just play with it. None of this stuff is really, you don't really have to worry about all this stuff. Plugins, like I said before, is not necessary. So that's pretty much it in terms of UI. Now, let's talk a little bit more about the Explorer window. Workspace is everything that you see in this window right here. This is all workspace. Okay. If I open workspace, this is everything that physically exists in your game. If I close this, then we have players. Players, this is the service that contains your player models when you join the game. Now there's actually, well, okay, yeah, I won't go too deep into that right now. Lighting is in charge of all of the lighting and ray tracing settings in your game. So, like, this kind of, like, effect that we have with the sun right now, that's the lighting service is responsible for that. I'm going to actually open my properties window right now. And we have this sun rays thing, which I can actually change the intensity of. So that's kind of neat. Actually, I shouldn't have closed that. You can actually click on lighting, and the lighting service itself has properties, properties that you can change. So the time of day is here. I could put 0, and then it becomes nighttime. I could put 12, and that's noon. So yeah. That's how you do that. Replicated first. You don't have to worry about this right now. You don't have to worry about replicated storage. Server script service is where you should put all of your server scripts for now. So right click on that, insert object and script. That is going to be the basics on how, like, this is where you should start with writing code. This script, or this service right here, was exclusively designed just to contain these script objects and nothing else. So this is the only thing that you would use a server script location for. You wouldn't put this anywhere else in your game. So I'm going to remove that for now. Server storage, you don't have to worry about. It's just for storing objects that you don't Like if you don't want an object to be displayed in your game, but you still want access to it, you can just click it and drag it into server storage, and it gets removed from here, but it's basically like a private container for objects. Um, Starter pack are like tools that players start out with the default Roblox system. Starter player, kind of the same deal, except it's for player scripts. Teams, sound service, chat, blah blah. You don't have to worry about that. So, yeah, that's basically it. For studio, and I apologize. I was talking a lot, and my mouth is extremely dry, so I'm probably stuttering and slurring words. But anyway, I hope this video was useful to you, and yeah, just use it whenever you need kind of a quick reference, I guess. I hope this helped.